So, December 2008. Well, after about 4 or 5 weeks of the new principal in March of 2008, I could see the writing on the wall. I decided to ask CFBT for a transfer. I was the first to do so and emailed them. There was no response, and yeah, this was CFBT's standard way of dealing with an issue. If they were unsure what to do nothing. In this way, they mimicked the Brunei culture which surrounded them. After a further month of the new regime at Maktab Science, I decided that a mere transfer would not be enough for me. The family were becoming unhappy in Brunei. Both Sergio and Julie complained about how boring Brunei was. Again, I think part of this was due to the fact that they were held back a year when they first came. They really had outgrown it. Then all of us became unsettled. Although the children were getting a very good academic schooling at the international school, we could see that the lifestyle of Brunei was not really giving the teenagers the life skills that they needed to survive in the real world. Such as how to get around, how to be independent, how to earn money, how to get a part-time job, and yeah, all those skills. And moreover, I was becoming de-skilled in a kind of increasingly dysfunctional professional culture. Roger went to Melbourne University and was then offered a place at Cornell. Now, neither he nor anybody else was expecting such a contrast between Brunei and Cornell. He didn't like it. We were worried that Sergio and Julie might not also like it if they went to a university outside Australia. I also really wanted to leave Brunei and do something else. However, having applied for many jobs in the past year, and not getting any response, I was becoming increasingly pessimistic. In spite of my qualifications and experience, my age was counting against me. Almost as a last resort, I then applied to CFBT's operations in Singapore and Abu Dhabi. I figured, correctly as it turned out, that since I was already with CFBT, I might have a better chance of getting one of these jobs. But Singapore were not interested, even though they wanted English language advisors and teachers of language as well. They required people to have English literature in their initial degree. This excluded me, even though I had 3 master's degrees and an educational doctorate. It was this type of blinkered bureaucratic blindness which drove me to distraction in the end. The bureaucracy just refused to think outside the box. They would cut off their noses to spite their faces just so they could play the game of exercising power. However, I have to admit that I've experienced exactly the same thing in Australia, although perhaps not to the same extent, but it's certainly not a question of nationality. Then there was a bombshell. I had a phone interview for Abu Dhabi, and that went very well, and I was waiting for having another one when I was hit by a most unexpected bombshell. CFBT told me that my name was on the veto list of 5 people from Maktab Science whose contract was not going to be renewed at the end of the year by the school. Now, we were all surprised. I could not think of anything that remotely resembled an incident in the school which could have accounted for the decision by the principal not to renew my contract. I mean, I knew she didn't like me and she didn't like Phantom of the Opera, but I was hoping that that wasn't going to be a reason for not renewing my contract, but who knows. Anyway, when I asked CFBT, they said, oh, they didn't know and no reasons had been given. When I pressed them further, they just said, oh, don't take it personally, it's just your turn. Well, I would have to say that even the jaw of a veteran expat like myself dropped open a little bit at this remark. I was dismayed that such a gratuitous remark could be made to me after 9 years of service. It was like saying to a Holocaust victim as they entered the gas chamber, oh, don't take it personally. It's just your turn. The fact was, CFBT just wanted us all to go quietly without causing any fuss. And, that would mean no problem then for CFBT. And the reality was CFBT could do nothing anyway. When the Ministry of Education in Brunei said jump, CFBT could only say how high. They were helpless in a crisis like this. This happened a few days before my second interview for Abu Dhabi, and of course I became quite anxious. But the interview came and I passed with flying colors. So to my immense relief, I was offered what appeared to be an excellent job. It was July and I still had 6 months to go at Maktab Science. So in spite of my frustration, I decided not to contest the non-renewal of my contract. I knew it would make no difference anyway. For some reason, neither the principal nor the deputy principal liked me. Or maybe it was my age, I don't know. It was strange because the deputy had appraised me a few weeks earlier and given me a glowing verbal report to my face. However, maybe her written report was different. I don't know. I did ask CFBT to try to find out, but they never got back to me. It might have been my age. I'll never know. By the time I left Brunei, CFBT had really become quite intimidated by their client, the Ministry of Education. Another reason for not contesting the mysterious decision to not renew was the fact that experience had taught me that I would be ostracized once it became known publicly among my colleagues that I had been terminated. I'd had this experience before in Melbourne in Australia, and it was one of the ugliest experiences I've ever had. When you are in the firing line, when you're a target, colleagues can be quite cowardly and worried about themselves. So they avoid you, even if you're an innocent victim of intimidation, and they avoid you in case they become guilty by association in the eyes of the persecuting entity. Any persecuted minority in a dictatorship knows how it feels when their own neighbors turn their backs on them out of cowardice. So anyway, I suffered in silence and I told no one at school. But of course, the 5 of us knew. Interestingly enough, when I arrived in Abu Dhabi later, I got an email from CFBT saying that the Ministry of Education in Brunei had written a letter to them saying that I had not signed in on the last day of school and asking me to provide witnesses as to my whereabouts on that day. Well, I was flabbergasted. Even after 9 years in that police state, I had not expected such a degree of pettiness. It was very disappointing after 9 years in a very challenging environment. 6 months after leaving Brunei, the new principal, after I left Brunei, the new principal was shunted sideways back into the Ministry of Education, where she could do less damage. But it was too late for me. I suppose I didn't have the very high expectations of CFBT when I arrived. I didn't, because I'd been contracting overseas for many years, and I had few illusions left about what to expect. I regarded them as a recruitment agency, and that is what they did very well. They were efficient enough in what they did, recruiting and helping with accommodation and making sure payments were made on time, etc. These were very important things for a foreigner overseas. But when it came to professional support, well, they were powerless. They were powerless to do anything on a teacher's behalf with regard to the routinely farcical situations encountered uh, at the ministry or in many of the schools. Although there were some good ones, the Bruneian principals were, for the most part, pretty inflexible, uh, underprepared, underqualified, and often incompetent and unprofessional. Experienced teachers had to put up with being treated like naughty little children a large part of the time. And this they did, and we did, because most of them, like us, were in Brunei for their children's sake. We were hostages to our families. I remember applying for a job in Brunei in the 1980s. In those days, Brunei did not hire families, but CFBT, when they came on the scene, they knew that once we had our families in the schools, we would have to toe the line. We would have to do what we were told basically by the ministry. So CFBT would try to do what they could to support us, but in the end, there was no choice. You either liked it or you left. Professional development was therefore often pretty light in the early years. Foreigners were not sent on courses anywhere at the ministry's expense. You were regarded as temporary and an expendable resource, basically a glorified slave. The arrogance of the Bruneian bureaucrat was legendary. But as I've said, it's the same everywhere. The main problem in Brunei was that they had the wrong curriculum. It was a Cambridge curriculum designed for native speakers of English. Obviously, the exam results were going to be dreadful. The Brunei children were not native speakers. So what did the Ministry of Education do? Well, of course, they blamed the teachers, of course. So let's change the teachers, let's bring in the New Zealanders or the South Africans or the English or the Americans or whatever. And I'm sure they tried all those things, but in the end, they always blamed the teachers. And, well, they sometimes blamed their own students as well. CFBT were also blamed for not providing good enough teachers. In the end, though, Cambridge sent a delegation to investigate. Well, I mean, it was pretty obvious what the problem was, but some group in Cambridge managed to get some nice trip out to Brunei over it, and they did an investigation, and of course the result was that the exam results improved the next year. Now, we experienced teachers, all knew why this was, but no one would say it. The tests had obviously been marked differently. we, the teachers, all knew. Now, this was the final straw on the camel's back for me. How could a university like Cambridge do something so underhand as this? But all in all, Brunei was a good experience for the family. The children got a good academic education out of it, and they enjoyed their lives there. Maria also got a good job at ISB for the final 4 or 5 years. So financially, it was very good for us too. But professionally, apart from the lovely students, most of the pedagogy and methodology and everything was quite appalling. And I had to do all my own professional development by doing, well, first of all, finishing one master's degree when I was there, and then doing an educational doctorate, which was really another master's degree, a fourth one. But in spite of this, in the last year or so, it was a bit like being on death row, waiting for execution in the Tower of London. In the end, I wasn't decapitated or burned at the stake, but I managed to escape. I was at least able to complete my educational doctorate during my time there. But as I was to find out later, professionally, I had indeed been de-skilled when in Brunei. The children, Julie wanted to leave Brunei. We didn't think she would be happy in a high school in Australia after Brunei. But she was a year young for university there. So we found a foundation program at Adelaide University, which was half high school and half university. And it fitted her very well. So she was happy to go there. And Sergio then enrolled at Adelaide University. Roger had decided to go to university then in Queensland. Maria and Julie had gone to Adelaide in August 2008. Serge went to stay with a friend in Hong Kong for a few months and then joined them in Adelaide. I accepted the job in Abu Dhabi, but stayed on in Brunei on my own for a few months and headed to Adelaide to join them for Christmas before going on to Abu Dhabi.